Welcome to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. I'm your host, Simone Morris, and I have a passion for empowering others to take responsibility for their careers. Yes, I've written several books on owning your career and am loving hosting this podcast. This podcast is for you if you're willing to make a shift to the driver's seat in your career. We feature leaders who inspire, empower, and motivate you for consistent career action for results. Please continue to join us every Sunday when a new episode is released. Let's get into this week's show. Welcome to this week's episode of the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. As always, I'm excited to have you listening to the show. Today is special. It's the end of season 12, and we are 193 episodes into the podcast, which I can't even believe. We've been doing this for a while. I want to give a shout out to the top 10 countries that are listening to the podcast. Of course, we are based in the United States, and also the US is our top audience for the podcast. But however, we have people listening from Nepal, Australia, the UK, Spain, Philippines, Ukraine, India, Germany, and Russia. So we are a global podcast, and I'm delighted that you continue to listen to the show and that you prioritize the ownership of your career, which I think is very important. When I first started the podcast, it was really about being in the driver's seat for your career. And for me, being in the driver's seat is really being very hands-on and intentional with your career, because it is necessary. And I speak from experience when I say that in the past, I've been hands-off in my career and as a result, had some regrets along the way in my career. My vision for the podcast is really for you, the listener, to be intentional about your career, for you to be in the driver's seat, take control, have the conversations that you need to have the career plan that you need to have the visibility to your leadership brand. I think these things are all important in moving forward in your career. Today is a Real Talk episode. And as you know, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, we talk about Simone's tips and guidance for owning your career. And I thought today we might do something interesting, which is talking about being stuck in your career. And how do you get out of being stuck in your career, or how do you make a career pivot? I think that's an important conversation to have. Once upon a time, I did feel stuck in my career, and I will tell you, listeners, what I did when I felt stuck in my career. I ended up taking a sabbatical. I took an unpaid sabbatical, and for those of you listening to the podcast for years, you may have heard me talk about the decision to take a sabbatical. And you know, it's hard to decide to pump the brakes on your career, but sometimes you need a timeout to really reflect on what is important, what your goals are, what your purpose is, and what you want to achieve in your career. And in those moments, if you are on the treadmill of career, you may not have time because you have a busy calendar, lots of clients to work with, etc. You may not have time to think the way you want to think. And so that's why, for me, when I decided to do a sabbatical, I'm thinking it was around 2010 that I decided to do that. For me, I needed a pause. It's not like my job, I felt like I had a really good position. I was not happy, and I knew that something needed to change. So I didn't want to just immediately launch into a job hopping thing, to jump from one scenario or situation to another. I wanted to take time to reflect, but I did not have time because of the projects that I was working on, because of the meetings that I was a part of. I didn't have time to think about career. So that can be you if you are feeling like there's a time for reflection, and also that you want to do something different or something needs to change, and that could have you in a career rut, then think about taking a sabbatical, because a sabbatical will help you to think, to slow down the car, and to allow you to decide what role you want to play, whether it's a driver or a passenger in your career. And so when I did that, I was able to really slow it down, really slow things down. And sometimes I do take a day off now because I feel like I need some space and I need some thinking time. I work with a lot of coaching clients, and so I'm talking about careers every day. I speak on the topic of careers as well. So sometimes I need a little space to digest, process, and regroup, and even think about my own career. It's not enough for me to listen to my clients about their career challenges and how to navigate and ascend in their careers, but also for me to be walking the talk and to focus on my own career as well. So I suggest really slowing things down and giving yourself time to think. If I go back to 2010, when I took the sabbatical, I really, there were people that didn't understand, and there will be people that don't understand when you decide that you want to take time to think about your career, because after all, this is your career. So you get to decide, you get to make that informed decision. I did take a 3-month sabbatical from work, unpaid, yes, unpaid. And I spent the time really as a time of clarification and discovery. Sometimes we need time to explore and discover. And I found that when I took a sabbatical in my career, I was able to go about discovering what Simone likes, what Simone dislikes, and dibble and dabble. And that's how I actually found my way to coaching. When I took the sabbatical, I was able to really focus on my coach's training education and really go down this career pivot, because what I was doing in corporate America was not career coaching or the work that I'm doing now. So it gave me the opportunity to really pause, reflect, pivot, select a new direction, get some education and awareness, and then to make the leap to shift into a new career. So if you are feeling stuck in your career, I want to say that there is hope, and that you've got to trust your own intuition. You've got to trust the messages that you are receiving, that something is off kilter, and it's time to create space and reflect on your career before you make the decision to pivot and to get out of the rut. So that was what was on my mind today, to really talk about career pivots, career clarity, and what you can do when you're in the driver's seat. When you are in the driver's seat, you are able to be self-aware. You're able to take control. Even if there are things that are outside of your control, you can take control of what is within your control and decide what you want to do to move forward. So keep that in mind, listeners. Now, today is a real talk, so we invite guests to join us, whether they have a career question, or actually you can also send in questions to me at POOYC. That's Power of Owning Your Career. That's the acronym POOYC at SimoneMorris.com. If you send me an email with your career question, when we have the next real talk, I will read your question and answer your career question on the air. So that's an option. We decided to try something different today and invite people to join the show. If you are joining and you have a question and you want to come on camera, that's great. But you can also type in the chat a question, and I'm happy to answer that question on this episode. So let me see if we have any questions, any career questions that we can talk about live on the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. While we're waiting to see if there are any questions, in season 12, one of the things that we talked about, or a couple of things that we focused on in this season, was authenticity, which I really appreciate, because sometimes we don't know how to be authentic in our careers, how to be embraced for our identities. And authenticity, it takes some time to be confident to be your authentic self. I reflect a lot on the saying where it says, bring your authentic self to the workplace. And that is not always the case, or it may not always feel safe for people to show up as their authentic selves in the workplace. So there has to be psychological safety so that you can feel vulnerable enough to show up and be your authentic self and to be celebrated for your authentic self. So I think that is something that comes with time and maturity, where you start to become confident about who you are and you show up as yourself in the workplace. So this season, we had an episode around authenticity. The other thing we talked about was education. I was fascinated by a conversation that we had with, I believe it was Braxton Wood, talked about being homeschooled and not pushing for that degreed, the education and job descriptions, and how there's this push for that, and how his work is around pivoting from you have to have a degree to get ahead in the workplace. So I found that a fascinating conversation. I am from the Caribbean, specifically Jamaica, and I know the messaging that I received when I was growing up was really about how education is a lever to really get ahead in your career. And quite honestly, listeners, education has been a game changer for me. I was the first one in my family to receive a college degree, and it really opened a lot of doors for me. Of course, in the beginning, I didn't know what to do with it, and my expectations were not in exact alignment. So I had to go about discovery and exploration, as I talked about earlier in the episode. But I have found that education is a key lever. So that was something interesting to talk about in the show. The other thing we talked about was confidence. I get a lot of requests or questions around how to build your confidence in your career. And that is something that I tackled on a previous Real Talk episode. We'll drop that one in the show notes for the episode. But confidence, I'm hearing that a lot. And not just from one gender, I'm hearing that across the board, that there are some challenges around confidence, career confidence in the workplace. So that is something that I want to spend time talking more and more about on the show, as they continue to empower you to really be in the driver's seat for your career. Part of that is really learning to be confident. And by the way, you don't have to be confident 100% of the times. There will be times in your career where you don't feel confident, and that's okay. That's okay, because there's a lesson to be learned in the moments that you don't feel confident. When you think about not being confident in your career, or feeling less than, or that you don't belong, I want you to take the time to examine what is happening in those moments. Who is in the room? What is the message that you're telling yourself in your head? What are you feeling? What is your body saying? What are you doing? What are you saying? I want you to just be self-aware when your confidence dips in your career. Think about what's happening and notice any patterns that come up for you. Because if you can see patterns, then you can come up with a plan on how to address. Let's say every time I'm in a meeting and there's senior leadership, my confidence tanks. Well, come up with a strategy of what to do when you're in a meeting with senior leaders. Don't just show up unprepared. Spend time being intentional and proactive about how to handle scenarios where your confidence dips. So that's something we talked about. And again, we're going to talk about this again and again on the podcast, because it comes up. I get some notes behind the scenes about confidence. It comes up in coaching. It comes up when I'm speaking on the topic of owning your career. So we will do a lot more talking about that in the coming season. The other thing I want to remind you of as a resource is that the 52 Tips for Owning Your Career book, that's an available resource for you. We can drop the notes for that in the chat. I'm sorry, in the show notes. And also the Power of Owning Your Career book, and also Achievement Unlocked Strategies to Set Goals and Manifest Them. These are all books that I've written that will be helpful to you in taking ownership of your career and also in navigating your career. So let's see if we have a question. So I have a comment here about self-improvement is not selfish. It can actually become selfless. Presenting your best self for someone is one of the best ways to be there for someone and to help. Being your best self ultimately means becoming your own boss and opening up your own shop. It's difficult to do that as an employee, to be your true self. Well, there are some people who are not positioned to be entrepreneurs. I know for me personally, it took me a while to embrace the reins of entrepreneurship. I do believe before I became an entrepreneur, I was an intrapreneur, which is someone who operates in the construct of a job, but they perform as if they're an entrepreneur, but it's inside of a job. So it's called an intrapreneur. So you don't necessarily, in my opinion, there is, of course, different perspectives here in my wisdom and years of experience, such as, with coaching and things like that. I think there's an opportunity in the right environment for you to show up as your authentic self. I get the notion that entrepreneurship gives a lot of freedom, but also in the right environment, in the place that celebrates diversity, you can show up as your authentic self. And I will say this, I do a lot of facilitation for a living. I do leadership development facilitation, and I've trained with different people or facilitated with different people. And I notice, depending on who I am facilitating with, there is comfort in being my authentic self. Depending on who I am delivering content and feeling safe, I can show up more authentically. So I take the point that when you're your own boss, there's flexibility to be your authentic self. There is a lot of adaptability still as an entrepreneur, but there's a lot more flexibility I have found, and responsibility as an entrepreneur. So, but I will say that the message around your authentic self, if you can't be your authentic self in your current environment, there's something there that's preventing you from being your authentic self. And it could be people, it could be systems, it could be the company, it could be a number of things. So look at that as well. Let's see, is there anything else I want to talk to you about? As always, I want to hear from you if there are questions, comments, thoughts about guests you want to see on the show or topics you want me to talk about during the Real Talk. I welcome that. I welcome the feedback on that. We also have a survey that we'll put in the show notes for this episode where you can give us some additional guidance. And as always, we welcome reviews so that other people can find the show. Again, I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the episode that we are on episode 193. So pretty excited about getting to the 200 number. It seems like a big number, and excited about what's to come. But the topic remains, there is a lot of passion and energy around being in the driver's seat for your career or building skill so that you can effectively navigate the workplace and be true to yourself and to, not have regrets in your career. So let me think about, has my formula for owning your career changed? It has changed because it has to change. There's not one formula for owning your career. This podcast is about the formula for owning your career, and we have all these guests talk about what their formula is. So everybody has a different spin to the formula for owning your career. For me, I still, at the heart of my formula for owning your career is really around strategic relationships, being really intentional about forming and nurturing strategic relationships in my career, being really intentional about my goals. Just last night, I was looking at my goals for 2024 and really using the wheel of life to hone in on what areas do I want to focus on in my career. And also branding, really thinking about your branding. I remember when I was in the corporate world, for me, branding was more about the company's brand and not my brand. And I want you to think about your personal brand, what you stand for, what you represent, and to spend the time working on that. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the Simone Morris brand and what it really means, what my company's brand is. And I think it's necessary to really continue to fine tune your brand and invest the time and resources to work on that. So do spend some time on that. I would say that is at the core of my formula, as well as self-care. I am working on it consistently to really make time in my day, to make time in the evening as well, to really be good to myself, to give myself grace, to be self-aware, and to do some skill building. There it is, education as well. See, the formula, as I think about it, it just expands, it ebbs and flows, and I suspect your formula will do the same. But that's it for now. It's been a pleasure to be with you in season 12. Thank you for continuing to listen to the podcast. Tell your friends about the podcast, continue to listen, and we appreciate everybody globally that's listening to the podcast and downloading episodes and leaving a review and engaging with us on the LinkedIn group that we have for the podcast. I appreciate you. And until next season, this is Simone Morris signing off. Have a great day and continue to be in the driver's seat for your career.
I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this week's empowering career story on the podcast. If you did, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Wherever you listen to the podcast, be sure that you are subscribing and that you rate and review the podcast. It's so important as we continue to spread the word of career empowerment. In addition, you can head over to the LinkedIn platform and join the Power of Owning Your Career discussion group. There you can have access to the guests who have been on the podcast, as well as others listening to the podcast, as well as myself, where we can continue the conversation. I hope to see you on that platform. You can also email me at pooyc@simonemorris.com if you have a suggestion for guest or a message that you want me to hear personally. Thanks so much, and make it an inspiring, empowering week in your career.